Imagine holding in your palm a miniature masterpiece crafted over 3,000 years ago, a delicate container no larger than your thumb, yet bearing intricate carvings of gods and symbols that whisper secrets from a civilization that mastered both beauty and eternity. These weren't just decorative trinkets, they held kohl, the iconic eye makeup that defined ancient Egyptian identity, worn by pharaohs and farmers alike to protect their vision from the harsh sun and to connect with the divine. What's truly astonishing isn't just that these containers have survived millennia in near-perfect condition, but that they were created using techniques and materials so advanced, we're still unraveling their mysteries today. The story of how these exquisite artifacts were made is a journey into the heart of ancient innovation, where artistry met practical magic in the hands of master craftspeople. These containers, often carved from ivory, wood, or precious stones, were more than just cosmetic holders. They were personal treasures, spiritual talismans, and status symbols, each one telling a story about the person who owned it. How did artisans with simple tools achieve such precision? What raw materials did they source from across deserts and rivers? And perhaps most intriguingly, why did something as everyday as a makeup container become an object worthy of accompanying Egyptians into the afterlife? In this video, we'll explore every step of this ancient process, from selecting materials with symbolic meaning to the delicate artistry that turned stone and bone into functional works of art. You'll discover how these craftspeople employed methods we still admire today, carving, polishing, and inlaying with astonishing skill, and why these small objects offer such profound insights into a culture that saw beauty, religion, and science as inseparable. By the end, you'll not only understand how these containers were made, but also appreciate the incredible legacy of innovation they represent, a testament to human creativity that has literally stood the test of time. To understand the craftsmanship behind these containers, we first need to appreciate the substance they were built to hold. Kohl was far more than simple makeup. It was a fundamental part of daily existence, woven into the very fabric of life along the Nile. Its use began with a strikingly practical purpose. The intense Egyptian sun glaring off the sand and water could cause unbearable glare and even damage one's sight. The thick, dark lines around the eyes, applied with a tiny stick from these very containers, acted as a natural sunblock, significantly reducing the sun's glare, much like the black grease modern athletes use. Furthermore, the lead-based salts within the kohl paste had unexpected medicinal benefits. Recent scientific studies suggest these compounds stimulated the production of nitric oxide in the skin, which boosted the immune system and helped prevent common eye infections that would have been rampant in the dusty, fly-filled environment. So, from the moment an Egyptian parent carefully applied kohl to their child's eyes, they were practicing a form of ancient medicine, but the significance of kohl extended far beyond the physical world and into the spiritual realm. The Egyptians saw the eyes as incredibly powerful and vulnerable windows to the soul. They believed that a malevolent force, often called the evil eye or the evil gaze of the god Seth, could bring about misfortune or illness. The deeply black, almond-shaped outline created by kohl was thought to make the eyes resemble the sacred eye of the god Horus, a potent symbol of protection, health, and royal power. By adorning themselves in this way, they were placing a divine shield over their most vulnerable feature, seeking the god's favor and deflecting harm. This profound spiritual belief elevated the kohl container from a mundane object to a sacred reliquary. It wasn't just storing cosmetic powder, it was safeguarding a powerful tool of protection and divine connection. This dual role, both practical and profoundly spiritual, is what made these small vessels so indispensable that they were deemed essential for the journey into the afterlife, ensuring the deceased could see and be protected for all eternity. Given this profound importance, it's no surprise the containers themselves were crafted from an astonishing array of materials, each selected with intention and meaning. For the highest echelons of society, the pharaohs, their families, and the elite, the container was a display of unimaginable wealth and divine status. Artisans fashioned these for royalty from gleaming gold and electrum, a shimmering natural alloy of gold and silver. These precious metal containers were often intricately inlaid with lapis lazuli imported from as far away as modern-day Afghanistan, vibrant turquoise from the Sinai Peninsula, and deep red carnelian. The choice of these specific, non-local materials was a powerful statement. It showcased the pharaoh's ability to command resources from across the known world, reinforcing their role as the central pillar of a vast and powerful empire. Crafting a container from gold required a completely different set of skills than working with stone. Artisans used a process of careful hammering and annealing, heating and cooling the metal to shape it without causing it to become brittle, often creating two separate halves that were soldered together with a precision that still feels modern. However, the truly fascinating story of these containers isn't just found in the tombs of kings, it's in the homes of everyday Egyptians. For the common people, who also relied on coal for protection and health, containers were made from far more accessible yet equally expressive materials. Skilled craftsmen utilized dense and fine-grained woods like ebony and cedar, which could be carved with beautiful detail and then polished to a high sheen. They also expertly worked with soft stones like steatite, also known as soapstone, which is easy to carve when first extracted but hardens with exposure to air. Alabaster was another popular choice, prized for its beautiful translucent quality and smooth, cool feel. The variety of materials meant a parallel variety of tools and techniques. A woodworker would employ tiny copper chisels, drills, and abrasive sands to shape and hollow out a container, while a stone carver might use a simple yet effective bow drill tipped with a hard stone point to patiently bore out the interior cavity, a process requiring immense patience and a steady hand. Perhaps the most ingeniously Egyptian material of all was faience. This was not true pottery, but a manufactured glazed quartz ceramic that the Egyptians held in extremely high regard for its brilliant blue and green colors, which evoke the life-giving waters of the Nile and the heavens. To create a faience coal pot, a craftsman would mix crushed quartz sand with small amounts of lime and natron, then shape it around a core material before firing it. During firing, the glazed surface would develop a gorgeous, glass-like shine. Faience was accessible, could be molded into an infinite variety of shapes from tiny columns to miniature animals, and symbolized rebirth and vitality, making it a perfect, spiritually charged vessel for a protective substance. Even organic materials like hollowed-out animal horns or sections of red were repurposed into simple, functional containers, proving that the desire to hold this sacred substance and the ingenuity to create a vessel for it extended to every level of Egyptian society. This incredible material diversity tells us that the drive for beauty, protection, and personal expression was a universal force, connecting the pharaoh in his palace to the laborer in the field through the common, daily ritual of applying coal. The journey of these containers' designs is a remarkable visual timeline of Egyptian civilization itself, stretching across millennia. In the earliest pre-dynastic periods, the forms were beautifully simple and purely functional. Archaeologists have found basic tubes made from reeds or hollowed-out segments of bird bone, sealed at one end with resin or wax. These were essentially natural cylinders, chosen for their convenience and availability, with little to no decoration. Simple small pots carved from soft stone like steatite also appear. often with just a groove around the rim to secure a now vanished leather or fabric cover. The priority was utility, creating a secure, portable vessel for a precious substance. This simplicity reflects a society where daily survival and establishing foundational culture were the primary focus, yet even then, the importance of coal was cemented enough to warrant creating a dedicated container for it. As Egyptian society coalesced under pharaonic rule in the Old and Middle Kingdoms, the designs began to evolve, becoming more refined and starting to incorporate symbolic meaning. While still often tubular or slightly conical, containers were now more carefully crafted from fine woods, ivory, and alabaster. Artisans began adding subtle decorative elements, incised lines around the body, simple geometric patterns, or bands of contrasting material. This was the era when the iconic coal stick itself, used to apply the makeup, started to be fashioned as a deliberate part of the set, sometimes stored in a separate compartment within the same tube or crafted from a different material like bronze or faience to create a pleasing contrast. The evolution here shows a culture with growing resources and artistic confidence, beginning to imbue everyday objects with a sense of style and ownership, moving beyond pure utility toward something aesthetically pleasing. The true explosion of creativity, however, occurred during the glory of the New Kingdom. This was the imperial age of Egypt, a time of immense wealth flowing into the capital from foreign conquests and expanded trade networks. The designs of coal containers transformed into breathtakingly elaborate works of miniature art, reflecting this new opulence and sophisticated worldview. The simple tube was reimagined as a rolled-up papyrus scroll, a column from a temple, or even a bound bundle of lotus flowers, architectural motifs rendered in precious materials. Containers were now routinely adorned with intricate carvings of protective deities like Bes, the dwarf god who watched over the household and children, or Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth. Hieroglyphic inscriptions offering blessings for health, protection, and beauty became common, turning the object into a permanent spoken charm. The most charming innovation was the rise of the figurative container, where the entire vessel was sculpted into a recognizable form. A particularly popular design was the hollowed-out figure of a monkey, often depicted squatting and holding its own tail, with the coal stored within its body and a separate lid that fitted snugly onto its back. These simian figures are rendered with such lively character and observation, some clutching fruit or peering curiously forward. Other containers took the shape of graceful ducks, their bodies becoming the pot and their elegantly curved necks and heads forming the handle. This shift from abstract form to figurative sculpture speaks volumes about the Egyptian artistic spirit during this peak period. It reveals a culture so confident and prosperous that it could invest this level of whimsical creativity and incredible skill into an object that was, at its heart, a personal cosmetic item. The container was no longer just a holder, it was a narrative, a piece of portable divinity, and a statement of personal taste and status, perfectly mirroring the technological advancements and abundant spirit of its time. Behind every exquisite container was an artisan whose skill transformed raw material into a cherished object of daily life. But who were these master craftspeople? In ancient Egypt, the path to becoming a craftsman was rarely a matter of individual choice. It was a destiny largely determined by birth. A young boy would typically follow directly in his father's footsteps, entering into a long and rigorous apprenticeship within a tightly knit workshop environment, often located in a special district of a major city like Thebes or Memphis. These workshops, or ateliers, were bustling centers of production, filled with the sounds of grinding stone, the smell of burning charcoal from furnaces, and the sight of masters patiently guiding the next generation. The training was hands-on and immensely practical, beginning with simple, repetitive tasks like preparing pigments, grinding abrasive sands for polishing, or fetching materials. Over many years, an apprentice would gradually be trusted with more complex work, learning to use the bow drill with a steady hand, to carve intricate hieroglyphs with a copper chisel, and to understand the unique properties of different woods, stones, and metals. This knowledge wasn't written down in manuals, it was absorbed through observation, repetition, and the oral transmission of techniques that had been refined over centuries, creating an unbroken chain of craftsmanship that stretched back generations. The social standing of these artisans was complex and fascinatingly dualistic. On one hand, they were not part of the illiterate masses. Their ability to read hieroglyphic inscriptions for custom orders and their mastery of complex mathematical proportions for design placed them among the educated class. They were highly valued by the state and the elite, considered essential workers whose output was crucial for religious rituals, royal authority, and daily life. A master craftsman attached to a major temple workshop or the royal palace enjoyed a position of significant privilege. He received good rations, bread, beer, fish, vegetables, and occasionally linen and oil, and lived in a state-provided house in a special community like el-medina, the famous village of the royal tomb builders. This security, however, came with a price. Their labor was largely in the service of the state or the gods. They worked on commissions dictated by priests and officials, following strict religious and artistic conventions. A carver making a coal pot in the shape of the god Bes couldn't simply use his imagination. He had to adhere to established forms that held specific magical meaning. Their artistic genius was expressed within a rigid framework, finding creativity in the flawless execution of a prescribed design rather than in purely original invention. Yet there was almost certainly a tier of independent artisans operating outside this rigid state system. In larger cities, skilled workers likely produced goods for a thriving private market, selling their wares directly to a growing middle class of merchants, soldiers, and lower-level officials who also desired beautiful objects. An independent craftsman would have had more freedom in his designs, perhaps creating more popular or whimsical forms like monkey-shaped containers that appealed to personal taste rather than strict religious doctrine. His income would have been less stable, dependent on the ebb and flow of commerce, but his creative autonomy may have been greater, whether serving the crown or the marketplace. These men, and they were almost exclusively men, formed the backbone of ancient Egypt's material culture. They were the invisible hands that turned the wealth of the empire and the resources of the land into the objects that defined a civilization, leaving behind a legacy of beauty and ingenuity that we are still piecing together from the wonderful, intimate artifacts they created. Walking into one of these ancient workshops, you'd be struck not by primitive chaos, but by a scene of organized, focused industry. Tucked away in a shaded courtyard or within a mud-brick building, the space would be arranged with clear purpose. A central feature would be a sturdy workbench, perhaps a simple slab of sandstone or a wooden table stained and scarred from years of use. Around it, the artisan would have had an array of specialized tools laid out within easy reach, each one designed for a specific task in the long process of transforming a raw block of material into a polished masterpiece. For the initial rough shaping of a hard stone like obsidian or carnelian, he might use a heavier stone hammer, patiently knocking away large chunks. To refine the form, a set of copper or bronze chisels of various sizes and points would be employed, their edges carefully hardened by hammering to make them durable enough to work the stone. The air would be thick with dust and the constant, rhythmic sound of tapping and scraping, a symphony of creation. One of the most vital and ingenious tools was the bow drill, a masterpiece of simple physics. This device consisted of a central drill bit made from a hard, pointed stone like chert, or later copper, set into a wooden shaft, a bow, similar to that used for hunting but with its string wrapped around the shaft, would be drawn back and forth. This action spun the drill bit at a high speed, allowing the craftsman to bore holes with incredible precision, whether it was hollowing out the deep interior cavity of a stone coal pot or drilling the tiny opening for a separate compartment for the applicator stick. To increase the drill's effectiveness, a skilled worker would often use an abrasive slurry of water and fine quartz sand, which acted like a primitive form of sandpaper, grinding through the hardest materials through patient, persistent friction. This same abrasive sand in various grits was also crucial for the next stage, polishing. Using a piece of leather or a smooth stone and wet sand, the artisan would spend hours meticulously rubbing the surface of the container, gradually transforming a rough carved object into one with that signature, glass-smooth finish that feels so incredible to touch even today. Storage was another key element of an efficient workshop. Shelves and baskets would hold the precious raw materials, blocks of alabaster awaiting their turn, segments of ivory from hippos or elephants, logs of imported ebony, and bundles of reeds for simpler projects. Pots of pigments for adding detail, vibrant malachite green, rich ochre red, and the deep blue of ground lapis lazuli would be carefully sealed. There's also compelling evidence from tomb paintings and archaeological finds that suggests the use of simple lathes for creating symmetrical pieces. A basic hand-powered lathe could have been used to rotate a wooden blank against a fixed cutting tool, allowing for the creation of perfectly cylindrical containers or beautifully rounded lids with an efficiency that freehand carving could never match. This image of a well-equipped, organized space, filled with the sounds and sights of dedicated craftsmanship, completely shatters any notion of ancient technology being rudimentary. It reveals a society that understood materials, physics, and the value of specialized tools, enabling their artists to achieve a level of precision that continues to astonish us millennia later. Now, let's visualize the immense challenge these craftsmen faced. Picture a master carver seated before a solid, unyielding block of alabaster, a material prized for its soft, luminous quality, but still incredibly dense and prone to cracking under even the slightest miscalculation. His goal isn't to create a massive statue, but a small, delicate vessel with paper-thin walls, a task requiring the steady hand of a surgeon and the patient heart of a monk. His primary tools for this monumental undertaking were surprisingly simple: a selection of stone hammers made from hard, dense rock-like dolerite for the initial rough work, and a set of copper chisels. We must remember that copper is a relatively soft metal, especially compared to the stone he was shaping. This meant the artisan wasn't brute forcing his way through the material. He was engaged in a delicate dance of persistent, controlled percussion. He would patiently tap, tap, tap with a small stone hammer against the copper chisel, each strike flaking away a tiny, precise sliver of stone. This method, known as pecking, was achingly slow, but it offered the craftsman ultimate control over the final form, allowing him to follow the natural veins and contours within the stone to prevent a catastrophic split. For the even more arduous task of working with the hardest stones like basalt or granite, the process became even more fascinatingly indirect. Instead of striking a chisel directly, the craftsman might employ a technique called pounding. He would use a hammerstone itself to directly batter the surface of the workpiece. This gradually pulverized the crystalline structure of the stone into a powdery dust, which could then be scraped away. It was a brutally slow and physically demanding method, but it was the only way to effectively work these ultra-hard materials without metal tools harder than bronze. Imagine the sheer physical endurance and unwavering focus required to spend weeks, perhaps even months, slowly reducing a granite block into an elegant, smooth-walled pot through millions of deliberate, careful impacts. Every single movement was intentional. A single misplaced strike with too much force could shatter weeks of painstaking progress, rendering the entire piece worthless. This was a high-stakes endeavor where the margin for error was virtually zero. The true marvel, however, lay in the hollowing out process. Creating the deep, narrow interior cavity of these containers seems almost impossible with the tools available. This is where the ingenious bow drill and abrasive sands became absolute game changers. After establishing the exterior shape, the craftsman would use a copper-tipped bow drill to start a pilot hole. But to widen and deepen this hole into a proper container, he would employ a brilliant trick. He might switch to a drill tip made not of metal, but of an even harder stone, like chert. As he worked the bow drill back and forth, an assistant or the craftsman himself would constantly feed a wet slurry of abrasive quartz sand into the growing hole. The hard, sharp particles in the sand would become embedded in the relatively soft copper drill shaft. This effectively created millions of microscopic cutting teeth, turning the entire drill into a grinding tool that could wear away even the hardest stone through relentless friction. This process, repeated for countless hours, allowed them to hollow out these vessels with remarkable symmetry and surprisingly thin walls. The final stages involved polishing the entire piece, inside and out, with progressively finer abrasives, from coarse sand to silts until the surface achieved that breathtaking, glassy smoothness that feels cool and perfect to the touch, a true testament to an artisan's patience and profound understanding of his materials. This drilling process was a symphony of physics and patience. The bow drill itself was a study in elegant efficiency. A craftsman would secure the container blank firmly in a bed of soft clay or hold it steady with his feet, freeing both hands to operate the tool. The drill bit, a simple copper point fixed to a wooden shaft, was set into a shallow starter hole. Then, the bow, a curved piece of wood with a slack string, was wrapped around the shaft. By moving the bow back and forth in a smooth, horizontal motion, the craftsman could spin the drill bit at a surprisingly high and consistent speed. The real magic, however, wasn't in the copper tip itself, but in the humble addition of a wet slurry of quartz sand and water. As the copper tip spun, it would grind against the sharp, hard sand particles, embedding them into its own softer metal surface. This effectively transformed the simple copper point into a self-renewing, diamond-tipped grinding tool, with millions of microscopic abrasive teeth constantly chewing away at the stone. The sand did the actual cutting. The copper was merely the vehicle that delivered the abrasive power with relentless, rotating force. Achieving a perfectly straight hole required another layer of ingenious technique. Any slight wobble or change in angle would result in an uneven, conical cavity that would ruin the delicate container. To prevent this, many craftsmen likely employed a simple guiding tool, a notched piece of wood or stone fixed securely above the workpiece. This guide would hold the drill shaft perfectly vertical, allowing it to spin freely within its notch while preventing it from leaning to either side. Some tomb paintings even suggest the use of stone weights placed on top of the drill shaft to apply gentle, consistent downward pressure, ensuring the drill bit didn't bounce or skip, but maintained a steady, grinding engagement with the material. This combination of a guided shaft and weighted pressure was the ancient world's equivalent of a modern drill press, enabling a level of precision that seems almost impossible for a hand-powered tool. The craftsman's skill was in maintaining a perfect, rhythmic motion with the bow for hours on end. His entire world narrowed to the sound of grinding grit and the gradual, imperceptible descent of the drill into the heart of the stone. The final challenge was perhaps the most subtle, achieving that legendary, glass-smooth finish on the interior surface. You might assume the abrasive drilling process would leave a rough, scratched interior, but the opposite is true. As the drilling progressed, the craftsman would periodically introduce finer and finer grades of abrasive sand into the hole. He might start with coarse grit to remove material quickly, then switch to a medium grit to refine the shape, and finally use a silt-like powder of extremely fine quartz for the finishing passes. This progressive polishing, happening inside the hole itself as the drill spun, meant the interior was being smoothed and burnished from the very beginning. By the time the cavity reached its desired depth, the walls were often already flawlessly smooth, having been meticulously ground and polished by thousands of rotations with the finest abrasive. This attention to an interior detail that no one would ever see is a profound testament to the Egyptian artisan's philosophy. It wasn't about creating something that merely looked finished from the outside. It was about achieving perfection in every aspect of the object, honoring the material and the sacred purpose the container would serve. The result is a tactile marvel, a whole so perfectly formed and silky to the touch that it feels less like carved stone and more like something that was somehow grown that way. While stone carvers relied on patient percussion, the woodworkers of ancient Egypt operated with a different kind of precision, transforming dense logs into delicate vessels using an arsenal of specialized tools that were far more sophisticated than they might first appear. Their primary adversary was wood, a material that could be beautifully forgiving yet dangerously prone to splitting. For a coveted imported hardwood like ebony, which is incredibly dense and almost black in color, the initial stages required immense strength and the right tools. A carpenter would first use a heavy copper axe to roughly hew a log into a more manageable block. Then, for the crucial task of shaping the exterior, he would turn to one of his most vital instruments, the adze. This tool, which looks like a hoe with a sharp, curved blade set at a right angle to its handle, was used in a sweeping, pulling motion to skillfully shave off thin curls of wood. By adjusting his grip and the angle of the swing, the craftsman could create the elegant curves of a duck-shaped container or the perfect cylindrical form of a tubular pot with astonishing control, his movements a testament to years of ingrained practice. To hollow out the interior, the woodworker employed a different set of skills and tools. For this, he would use a bow drill very similar to the stoneworkers, but with a crucial difference in technique. Instead of relying on abrasive sand to do the cutting, the woodworker's copper drill bit would cut directly into the softer material, pulling out long, thin spirals of wood dust. To create a wide cavity, he would use a process called broaching, drilling a series of closely spaced holes in a circular pattern, and then using a sharp chisel to carefully break away the thin webs of wood left between them. This method allowed him to efficiently remove the bulk of the material without putting undue stress on the walls of the container. The final interior smoothing was achieved with a specialized curved chisel called a gouge, which could scrape and shape the concave surface until it was perfectly smooth. Every step was a calculated balance between removing material quickly and preserving the integrity of the increasingly thin walls, a high wire act performed with copper tools on priceless imported timber. Perhaps the most impressive display of their skill, however, was in the joinery and decorative inlay. These weren't just simple, scooped-out blocks of wood. Many containers feature separate bases, lids, and even internal compartments that were crafted individually and then fitted together with seamless precision. A lid might be turned on a simple lathe, a device that rotated the wood against a fixed chisel, to create a perfect, snug fitting disc. For the most luxurious pieces, the desire for color and contrast drove the art of inlay. A craftsman would meticulously carve out a channel in the surface of an ebony container and then carefully hammer in a thin strip of gleaming electrum or bright turquoise, creating a stunning visual pattern. He might even create a tiny, intricate mosaic using pieces of faience, shell, or colored glass, each fragment set into a bed of resin. This practice of combining materials wasn't just for show. It mirrored the Egyptian love of symbolism and contrast, weaving together the earthly richness of wood with the divine brilliance of precious stones and metals turning a functional object into a narrative tapestry of texture and meaning. Of all the materials used by these master artisans, one stands out as uniquely and quintessentially Egyptian faience. This was not clay-based pottery as we know it today, but a spectacularly innovative manufactured material, a glazed quartz ceramic that the Egyptians perfected and adored for its brilliant, shimmering colors that evoked the very essence of life itself. The most prized hue was a luminous blue or blue-green, directly symbolizing the life-giving waters of the Nile River, the fertile fields that sprouted along its banks, and the vast heavens above. To own or use an object made of faience was to hold a piece of these fundamental forces in your hand. It was a material saturated with meaning, believed to possess magical properties of regeneration and protection. This deep symbolic power made it the perfect substance for crafting coal containers, which were themselves vessels of protection and rebirth. The process of creating faience was a complex alchemy that transformed the most common of materials into something extraordinary. It began not with river clay, but with crushed quartz. Craftsmen would grind quartzite rock, pebbles, or even sand into a fine powder. This quartz core was then mixed with small amounts of two critical additives, a flux and a source of calcium. The flux was typically natron, the same salt harvested from dry lake beds that was used in mummification. Natron's role was scientific magic. It dramatically lowered the melting point of the quartz sand. The calcium, often from crushed lime or eggshells, acted as a stabilizer, preventing the finished object from becoming too brittle. A tiny amount of a copper mineral, like malachite or chrysocolla, was added to the mixture as the colorant. When fired, this copper would be the source of that iconic turquoise blue glory. Finally, all these dry ingredients were carefully blended with just enough water to create a workable paste, a damp, crumbly mixture that could be shaped by hand. Shaping this quartz paste required a completely different approach than working with clay or stone. Because the mixture wasn't particularly plastic or sticky, artisans often relied on molding techniques. They would press the paste firmly into pre-formed molds made of clay or carved stone. These molds could create an endless variety of popular forms instantly, from simple tubes and discs to intricate shapes like falcons, lotus flowers, or the ever-popular monkey figurine. For more unique pieces, a craftsman might model the paste by hand around a core material, much like a sculptor building up a form. Once shaped, the object was left to dry completely. In this pre-fired state, it was incredibly fragile, known as greenware, and had to be handled with the utmost care. The surface at this stage was a dull, matte white, giving no hint of the radiant transformation that was about to occur. The real magic happened in the kiln. Firing faience was a precarious and highly skilled procedure. The objects were placed carefully into a hot kiln, and the craftsmen had to meticulously control the atmosphere inside. The key was to create an environment with fluctuating levels of oxygen. During the firing process, the natron flux would migrate to the surface of the object, carrying the copper colorant with it. There, at the surface, it would vitrify, literally melting into a thin, glassy layer. This wasn't an applied glaze, it was a self-glazing material, with the gorgeous, glassy surface emerging from within the object itself through chemical reaction. This efflorescence technique is what gives ancient Egyptian faience its unique, sugary crystalline texture and its depth of color, which can vary from a thin, translucent turquoise to a thick, opaque royal blue, depending on the exact recipe and firing conditions. The final result was a durable, water-resistant, and breathtakingly beautiful object that seemed to glow from within, a true testament to Egyptian scientific ingenuity and their unparalleled artistic vision. For the most opulent containers, destined for the hands of royalty or to be presented as lavish temple offerings, Egyptian artisans employed a final, breathtaking technique that transformed a beautifully carved object into a radiant symbol of divine power, gilding. This process involved adhering incredibly thin sheets of precious metal, almost always gold, onto a core material of wood or stone. Gold was the chosen medium for this ultimate expression of luxury, not merely for its obvious monetary value, but for its profound spiritual significance. The Egyptians saw gold as the flesh of the gods. It was incorruptible, it never tarnished, and it shone with the brilliant, eternal light of the sun god Ra himself. To coat a coal container in gold was to literally encase it in divinity, creating an object that was both a functional item and a potent religious icon, ensuring its owner was under the direct protection of the gods. The process began not with the gold itself, but with the creation of a perfect core. A master woodcarver or stoneworker would first sculpt the container to its final, desired shape, whether it was a simple tube, an elegant column, or an intricate figurine of a monkey or deity. This underlying form had to be flawlessly smooth, because any imperfection in the carving, a tiny groove, a rough patch, an uneven plane, would be glaringly visible through the paper-thin metal veneer that was to be applied. For a wooden core, the surface would be polished to a high sheen using fine abrasives and buffing cloths. For a stone core, often made of a cheaper material like limestone that was easier to carve, the finish had to be absolutely glassy. This preparatory stage was critical. It was the foundation upon which an illusion of solid gold would be built. The adhesive used to bond the gold to the core was a masterful recipe of natural ingredients, a glue that needed to be incredibly strong, remain stable for centuries, and not discolor the precious metal. Artisans likely used a combination of plant-based resins, such as the sap from the acacia tree, and animal-based glues made by boiling down animal hides, bones, and tendons. These materials would be carefully heated to a workable consistency, becoming sticky and viscous. The craftsman would then apply a thin, even layer of this natural adhesive over the entire surface of the core object. Timing was everything. The glue had to be applied when it was tacky but not fully set, allowing the gold leaf to be carefully positioned and pressed into place. The gold itself was prepared through a feat of ancient metallurgy. Using a heavy stone hammer, a metalworker would painstakingly beat a small lump of pure gold between sheets of leather or parchment into an astonishingly thin leaf, sometimes only a few microns thick, thinner than a human hair. These fragile sheets were then carefully cut into manageable pieces using a sharp blade. Handling this material required immense skill and a perfectly still environment. A sudden draft or a clumsy breath could send the delicate leaf curling away or tearing irreparably. The gilder would use a soft brush, perhaps made of reeds or fine animal hair, to lift the leaf and gently lay it onto the glued surface. Using padded tools or his own careful fingers, he would then gently burnish the gold, smoothing it down and ensuring it made complete contact with the adhesive, conforming to every contour of the carved form beneath. The true mark of a master gilder, however, was what happened after the gold was applied. To prevent the container from looking like a simple, shiny gold brick, artisans would often go back over the surface and tool it with intricate patterns. Using fine, pointed tools made of bronze or even hardened wood, they would engrave delicate designs directly into the soft metal veneer. This could include detailed scenes from mythology, geometric patterns, the name and titles of the owner, or the protective symbols of deities like the wedged eye. This tooling added texture, narrative, and an extra layer of breathtaking craftsmanship, catching the light in different ways and making the surface come alive. The final, most extravagant step was inlay. To push the luxury even further, sections of the gold leaf might be carefully cut away and replaced with settings for precious and semi-precious stones. A depression would be carved into the core material itself before the gold was applied. After gilding, a bezel of fine gold wire might be soldered around the empty space, and then a craftsman would set a piece of polished lapis lazuli, turquoise, carnelian, or feldspar into the void. The effect was spectacular, a gleaming gold surface, intricately engraved, now punctuated with dazzling bursts of deep blue, vibrant green, or blood red. This combination of materials, the solar brilliance of gold paired with the cosmic depth of lapis lazuli, was the ultimate artistic expression of ancient Egyptian ideology, representing the union of the sun and the heavens, of the pharaoh and the gods. It transformed a personal cosmetic item into a microcosm of the universe, a piece of divine regalia meant to protect and glorify its owner for all eternity. Every inch of these containers was a canvas for meaning, a surface where art and magic merged to create a powerful shield for the owner. The most immediate and potent symbols were the deities themselves, carved or painted onto the surface to offer their constant vigilance. The dwarf god Bes was an extraordinarily popular choice, his distinctive ugly beautiful face, a wide, leonine visage with a protruding tongue and feathered crown peering out from the curves of the container. His role was as a protector of the household, of women, children, and especially of childbirth, placing his image on a coal pot, an object used to safeguard the vulnerable eyes of a child, was a direct invocation of his power to ward off evil spirits and nightmares. Similarly, the hippopotamus goddess Taweret, with her massive pregnant body, crocodile tail, and dagger-like teeth, was another formidable guardian. Her fearsome appearance was precisely what made her so effective. She used terror to fight terror, scaring away any malevolent forces that might threaten the health of the family. By incorporating these deities, the container transcended its physical form, becoming a portable temple that brought divine protection into the most intimate moments of daily life. Beyond specific gods, the natural world provided an endless source of symbolic motifs, each plant and animal carefully chosen for its connection to concepts of life, rebirth, and protection. The lotus flower was among the most beloved of these symbols. Each day, the lotus emerges pristine from the murky waters, its petals reopening to the sun. This daily cycle made it an unparalleled symbol of regeneration, the sun's victory over darkness, and the promise of eternal life. A coal pot shaped like a lotus bud or adorned with blooming lotus flowers wasn't just pretty, it was a powerful amulet for rebirth, ensuring the owner would awaken each morning and, ultimately, in the afterlife. The papyrus plant carried its own profound meaning. Growing in dense, lush clusters along the Nile, it represented the untamed, fertile chaos of the primordial marsh from which all life emerged. It was a symbol of Lower Egypt itself, of abundance, and of growth. Clusters of papyrus reeds carved onto a container invoked this life-giving energy, a wish for vitality and flourishing health for its owner. Perhaps the most direct and personalized form of magic was the inclusion of hieroglyphic inscriptions. These weren't mere decoration. The Egyptians believed in the power of the spoken and written word to manifest reality. A simple phrase carefully carved along the rim of a container could activate a permanent protective spell. One of the most common inscriptions was a simple blessing, "For your health," or "For the health of the eyes." This transformed the act of applying kohl into a ritual of healing, each stroke of the applicator enacting the written wish. More elaborate inscriptions might invoke a specific god, asking for their favor. A phrase like "Horus gives protection" directly called upon the falcon god to extend his sacred power over the user. For royal containers, the inscriptions often included the kartach of the pharaoh, binding the owner's fate to the strength and divinity of the king. And on a wonderfully practical level, these hieroglyphs could also serve as ownership tags, naming the specific person often with their titles like scribe of the treasury or priest of Ammon, for whom the object was crafted. This combination of spiritual invocation and personal identification shows how these objects straddled two worlds. They were both a functional personal item and a sacred text written in miniature, a permanent prayer etched in stone, wood, or faience. This artistic leap into the miniature sculptural form represents one of the most delightful and technically ambitious chapters in the story of these containers. Moving beyond simple geometric shapes, Egyptian artisans began to envision the entire vessel as a singular, cohesive sculpture, often no larger than a human thumb. These weren't just pots with decorations on them, they were fully realized three-dimensional figures, each one a tiny universe of symbolism and story. The most popular and charming of these forms was undoubtedly the monkey. These clever creatures, likely imported from lands to the south, were a common sight in wealthy households, kept as exotic pets for their entertaining antics. Artisans captured their lively spirit perfectly, sculpting them in a characteristic squatting pose, often clutching a piece of fruit to their chests with their delicate hands. The genius of the design lay in its functionality. The coal itself was stored within the hollowed-out body of the monkey, while its long, curved tail would often coil around to form a practical carrying handle or a loop for a string. A separate lid, expertly crafted to fit with airtight precision, was seated neatly onto the creature's back, making the entire sculpture a single, seamless container. The faces of these monkey figures are particularly captivating, often bearing an expression of curious intelligence, as if the animal is peering directly at the user with playful awareness. This transformation of a wild animal into a beloved, protective household object speaks volumes about the Egyptian ability to find wonder and meaning in the natural world around them. Another immensely popular sculptural form was the duck. This bird held significant symbolic weight associated with the concept of creation and rebirth. Ancient Egyptian mythology told of the primordial goose whose honk broke the silence at the dawn of time, and the duck carried echoes of this powerful creative force. Sculpted in a graceful, resting pose with its head turned back along its body, the duck's form was ideally suited to become a container. The plump body was hollowed out to hold the coal, while the elegantly arched neck and head created a natural, ergonomic grip for the user to hold between their fingers while applying the makeup. The surface of these duck containers was often adorned with incredibly fine, incised details suggesting individual feathers, and many were painted in vibrant colors or inlaid with contrasting materials to highlight the eyes and beak. Using this elegant avian form transformed the daily ritual of applying makeup into a symbolic act of aligning oneself with the forces of creation and renewal, a small moment of connecting with the gods each morning. For those seeking even more direct divine intervention, containers were sculpted into the forms of powerful protective deities. We find them shaped like the god Bes, his full dwarf-like body rendered in the round, his gruff but benevolent face offering a watchful gaze. Others took the form of the hippopotamus goddess Taweret, her formidable pregnant body and gaping mouth serving as a formidable warning to any evil spirit that might approach. Perhaps the most symbolically potent were the containers crafted in the likeness of He, the god of eternity, who is depicted kneeling while holding notched palm ribs symbolizing millions of years. To own a coal container in the form of He was to hold the very concept of infinite time in your hand, a powerful amulet for long life and everlasting protection. The creation of these intricate figurines required a sculptor's mind and a jeweler's hand. An artist had to visualize the final, complex three-dimensional form within a solid block of ivory or wood, then carefully remove everything that wasn't part of that figure. Every cut had to be considered not just for its artistic effect, but for how it would impact the structural integrity of the incredibly thin walls that would contain the precious coal powder. The pressure was immense, as one slip of a chisel could decapitate a deity or sever a monkey's tail, ruining weeks of painstaking labor and a priceless piece of raw material. This fusion of art and function elevated these objects into the realm of amulets. In ancient Egypt, an amulet was far more than a lucky charm. It was a functional magical device, an object believed to be actively charged with protective power. A coal container in the shape of Bes didn't just reference the god, it was thought to actually contain his spirit and wield his protective energy. The very act of opening the lid and touching the coal inside was a way of physically connecting with that divine power, of drawing it forth to create the protective lines around the eyes. This is why we so often find these sculptural containers in burial contexts, placed carefully within the wrappings of mummies. They weren't just sentimental keepsakes meant for the afterlife, they were essential pieces of functional magical equipment, ensuring the deceased would be able to see in the dark of the tomb, be protected from the dangers of the underworld, and ultimately be reborn into eternity with their sight, both physical and spiritual, perfectly intact. The application of color to these already exquisite objects was where science and symbolism truly merged into high art. An artisan's workshop would have contained a vibrant palette of pigments, each one meticulously sourced and prepared, transforming raw minerals into a painter's medium. The brilliant blues came from finely ground lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone imported across vast deserts from distant Afghanistan. Lush greens were crafted from malachite, a copper carbonate mineral mined in the eastern deserts and the Sinai Peninsula. Vibrant reds and ochres were derived from iron oxides, readily found in the desert cliffs, while the deep, rich black used for outlines and hieroglyphs was most commonly soot or powdered charcoal. These were not mere decorative choices, each hue was a word in a visual language, a carrier of profound meaning that was literally baked into the culture. Before a single brushstroke could be applied, these hard, granular minerals had to be transformed into a workable paint. This was a delicate and precise alchemical process. The craftsman would place a small amount of the powdered pigment onto a hard, flat stone palette, often made of granite or basalt. Next came the critical ingredient, the binder. This substance acted as the glue that would hold the pigment particles together and adhere them permanently to the surface of the container. Two binders were particularly favored for their durability and working properties. Gum arabic, a natural sap harvested from acacia trees, was a popular choice. When mixed with water and pigment, it created a smooth, fluid paint that dried to a matte finish. For a slightly different consistency, egg whites could be used, creating a medium that was a primitive form of tempera. The artist would add tiny drops of water to the pigment pile and then grind it meticulously with a rounded stone pestle, working the binder and pigment together in a circular motion for a long time. This wasn't a quick mix, it was a process of grinding the particles down to an incredibly fine consistency, ensuring the resulting paint would be smooth, vibrant, and free of any gritty texture that could ruin the fine details of a carving. The final result was a small, perfect cake of intensely colored paint, ready to be activated with a wet brush. The application of this paint was an act of reverence and immense skill. Brushes were handmade with exquisite care, typically from chewed-up twigs of the Salvadora persica tree, which naturally frayed into soft, flexible fibers, or from reeds that were carefully hammered at one end to separate the strands. For the finest details, such as the hieroglyphs on a cartouche or the feathers on a sculpted duck, a single sliver of red or a sharpened stick might be used as a primitive pen. The painter's hand had to be incredibly steady, often bracing against a workbench to apply the intricate patterns that brought symbols to life. The paint was applied in layers, sometimes over a base coat of white gypsum or plaster, to make the colors pop with even greater intensity against a dark material like ebony or basalt. Once complete, the painted object might be left to air dry, or in some cases, very gently heated to set the colors. The final effect was breathtaking, a symphony of brilliant, symbolic color laid over a masterfully carved form, creating an object that engaged the senses of touch and sight in perfect harmony. Every color choice was a deliberate communication, a layer of magic and meaning applied to the container. White, typically made from gypsum or powdered limestone, was the color of purity, sacredness, and joy. It was associated with the priestly class and often used for ceremonial objects. A white background on a container could signify its use in a sacred context. Green, from malachite, was the color of vegetation, new life, growth, and resurrection. The ancient Egyptian word for green was also the word for verdancy and flourishing. Using green on a container was a direct invocation of these life-giving forces, a wish for health and vitality for its owner. Red, from iron oxides, was a color of potent duality. It could symbolize the destructive, chaotic power of the desert and the god Seth, but it could also represent the life-giving power of blood and the sun's vital energy. Its use had to be carefully considered within the overall design, but two colors held the most profound and universal significance. Black, from carbon or manganese, was the color of the fertile Nile silt, the source of all Egypt's agricultural wealth. It was known as Kemet, the Black Land, and thus black symbolized fertility, resurrection, and the afterlife. It was the color of the underworld gods, like Osiris, and its use on a coal container directly mirrored the black makeup itself, reinforcing the themes of protection and rebirth. The most prestigious color of all was the brilliant, celestial blue, painstakingly created from costly imported lapis lazuli. This was the color of the heavens, the home of the gods, and the divine hair of the deity Ammon. It symbolized creation, divinity, and the eternal sky. A container adorned with this precious pigment wasn't just beautiful, it was a fragment of the cosmos, a direct link to the divine realm, ensuring its owner was forever under the protection and favor of the gods. Through this sophisticated language of color, a simple application of paint became the final, powerful incantation on an object already brimming with meaning. The challenge of keeping that precious coal powder perfectly dry and securely contained was one the ancient Egyptian artisans solved with a breathtaking array of ingenious sealing mechanisms. Given the humid environment of the Nile and the fine, powdery nature of the makeup, a simple open pot was never an option. The most basic yet effective solution, likely used by the vast majority of people, was a simple lid made of perishable materials. A small disc of linen or leather would be placed over the mouth of the container and then securely tied in place with a thin cord of woven plant fiber or sinew, which would be threaded through a small groove carved just below the rim of the pot. This groove, a seemingly minor detail, was a stroke of pure practical genius, ensuring the cord wouldn't slip off and the cover remained taut and secure. For an even tighter seal, the lid might be dabbed with a bit of beeswax or resin, creating a primitive but effective waterproof barrier. This simple, low-tech solution was undoubtedly the workhorse of coal storage, proving that effective design doesn't always require complexity. For the more affluent, however, the need for security was matched by a desire for elegance and convenience, leading to the development of integrated, non-perishable lids. One of the most common and clever designs was the simple stopper lid, often crafted from the same material as the container itself. A master woodturner or stone carver would create a perfectly fitted plug, sometimes slightly conical in shape, to form a tight, friction-fit seal when pressed into the opening. The precision required for this was astounding. The lid had to be loose enough to remove easily with a fingertip, yet tight enough to not dislodge if the container was jostled or tipped over. Many of these stoppers featured a small, sculpted knob on top for easy grip, a tiny lotus flower, a berry, or even a miniature animal head, turning a purely functional component into a decorative finial. In some exquisite examples, particularly in alabaster vessels, the stopper was even attached to the main body by a short, delicate cord of gold wire, ensuring the precious lid could never be separated and lost, a solution that is both practical and speaks volumes about the value placed on these complete, beautiful objects. The true pinnacle of this ingenuity, however, was the rotating lid, a mechanism that showcases a sophisticated understanding of mechanics in miniature. This design is most famously seen in tubular containers, often made of wood or ivory. The tube itself would be carved with two openings, one on the top and one on the side. Inside a separate hollow inner cylinder, the lid itself could be rotated. This inner cylinder also had a single hole drilled through its wall. When the inner cylinder was turned so that its hole aligned with the hole on the top of the outer tube, the user could tap out a small amount of coal powder. To close it, they would simply give the inner cylinder a slight turn, misaligning the holes and sealing the contents completely from the inside. The engineering precision needed to craft two perfectly round, concentric cylinders from organic materials that could expand or contract with changes in humidity, and to have them fit together snugly yet still rotate smoothly, is nothing short of masterful. It's a mechanism that would feel perfectly at home on a modern container, yet it was conceived and executed thousands of years ago. In the later periods of Egyptian history, particularly during the Greco-Roman influence, we even see evidence of the earliest screw-top mechanisms. These were not threaded in the modern sense with spiral grooves, but rather utilized a simple bayonet-style fitting. A lid would have a small peg on its underside that would slot into an L-shaped channel carved inside the neck of the container. The user would place the lid on and give it a slight twist, locking the peg into the short horizontal leg of the L, creating a secure, waterproof seal that was incredibly advanced for its time. Each of these mechanisms, from the humble tied cloth to the complex rotating lid, was a direct response to the sacred imperative of protection. They weren't just keeping powder in, they were sealing divine protection and good health safely away from the elements, from evil spirits, and from the passage of time itself, ensuring the magic within remained potent until the next time it was needed. The final transformative stage of the container's journey from a rough carved form to a cherished masterpiece was a testament to the artisan's unwavering commitment to perfection, a rigorous process of quality control that would feel familiar in any modern workshop. This wasn't a mere afterthought, it was an integral, painstaking phase where the object was scrutinized, refined, and ultimately approved for its sacred duty. The most critical tool in this final inspection wasn't a complex device, but the human hand itself. A master craftsman would run his fingertips over every millimeter of the surface, his eyes closed, reading the object like a text. His heightened sense of touch, developed over a lifetime of work, could detect imperfections invisible to the naked eye, a hairline crack forming beneath the surface of a faience piece, a minuscule bump on the curve of a duck's back, or the faintest scratch inside the drilled cavity of a stone pot. This tactile inspection was the first and most important defense against flaws, ensuring that only objects meeting the highest standard of smoothness and structural integrity would ever leave the workshop. The primary method for achieving that legendary, glassy finish was a progressive polishing regimen using abrasives of increasingly fine grit. The process began with a coarse slurry of quartz sand and water, which the craftsman would apply with a piece of leather or a rough stone block, using broad, forceful strokes to remove all the major tool marks left by chisels and drills. He would then rinse the object and move to a medium-grade abrasive, perhaps a finer sand gathered from a different source, to begin smoothing out the scratches left by the first stage. The final polish was where the true magic happened. For this, the artisan might use a paste made from incredibly fine powders like ground limestone or even cerussite, applied with a soft, wet cloth or even the palm of his hand. For the hardest stones, a final buffing with a dry, silky cloth could bring out an almost wet-looking luster. This wasn't just about aesthetics. A perfectly polished surface on a stone or faience container was less porous, helping to protect the precious coal inside from moisture and contamination. The time invested was immense, but the result was an object that felt impossibly perfect, a tactile experience that confirmed its quality and value the moment it was held. Beyond the physical feel, a visual inspection under different lights was crucial. An artisan would examine the piece in the bright, direct light of the noon sun to check for any visual inconsistencies in the material, a cloudiness in the alabaster, an uneven color distribution in the faience, or a flaw in the grain of an ivory tusk. He would also check it in the softer, raking light of dawn or dusk, which would cast subtle shadows, revealing any minuscule dips or ridges on the surface that his fingers might have missed. For containers with painted or inlaid details, this inspection was even more rigorous. The master would ensure the hieroglyphic inscriptions were perfectly Chinese letter and error-free, as a mistake in a protective spell could render it powerless or, worse, bring misfortune. He would check that the inlaid strips of turquoise or lapis were perfectly flush with the surface of the ebony wood, and that the adhesive hiding beneath showed no unsightly seepage. Every element on every plane had to be flawless. On rare but significant occasions, this process of verification extended to the application of a maker's mark. While not as systematic as modern branding, there is evidence from certain workshops, particularly those specializing in fine stone vessels, of artisans incising a tiny, discrete symbol onto the base or interior of a finished piece. This could be a simple geometric sign, a miniature animal, or a shorthand hieroglyph. This mark served multiple purposes. Within a large state-sponsored workshop, it could act as a quality control signature, allowing a foreman to identify which craftsman was responsible for a particularly fine piece or to trace the source of a substandard object that failed inspection. For an independent artisan, it could function as an early form of branding, a way to build a reputation for excellence so that a discerning buyer, upon seeing that tiny hippopotamus or zigzag line, would know they were acquiring a container from the workshop renowned for the finest calcite vessels in Thebes. This practice hints at the beginnings of commercial identity and personal accountability, connecting the hands that made the object directly to the pride in its creation. These specialized tools were far from crude. They represented the pinnacle of Bronze Age technology, each one meticulously designed for a specific task in the intricate dance of creation. The most fundamental tools in the artisan's kit were his chisels, and the choice of material was a brilliant adaptation to the challenge. While we might expect hard steel for such work, Egyptian craftsmen mastered the use of copper and bronze, softer metals that required a deep understanding of their properties. A copper chisel couldn't simply be hammered relentlessly into hard stone, it would bend and deform. The secret was a process called work hardening. As the artisan hammered and shaped the copper to form the chisel, the metal would become harder but also more brittle. To counter this, he would periodically anneal the tool by heating it in a charcoal fire until it glowed a dull red, then quench it in water, restoring its malleability. This cycle of hardening and annealing allowed him to maintain a sharp, durable edge capable of pecking away at even the toughest granite, a testament to their sophisticated metallurgical knowledge applied on a miniature scale. For the incredibly delicate work of hollowing out a vessel or drilling a precise hole, the bow drill was the undisputed marvel of the workshop. This deceptively simple device harnessed basic physics to achieve remarkable results. It consisted of four main parts: a vertical shaft, a weighted flywheel, a capstone, and the bow itself. The shaft was typically made of a strong, straight wood like tamarisk. The flywheel, often a heavy, carved stone disc fixed to the shaft's base, provided crucial momentum and stability, keeping the drill spinning true and preventing it from wobbling off course. At the very top of the shaft sat the capstone, a small handheld piece of wood or stone with a carved depression. The craftsman would press down on this capstone, applying steady, controlled pressure while his other hand sawed the bow back and forth. The bow, a curved piece of wood with a loose string, was wrapped once around the shaft. This sawing motion spun the shaft at high speed, turning the drill tip, a sharp piece of flint, copper, or hardened wood, into a relentless grinding instrument. The true genius of the drill, however, lay in the use of an abrasive slurry. While the copper or stone drill tip provided the rotation, it was the addition of a wet paste of quartz sand and water that did the actual cutting. As the drill spun, the hard, sharp sand particles became embedded in the relatively soft copper or the pores of the wooden shaft. This effectively coated the drill in millions of microscopic, diamond-hard teeth, creating a grinding tool that could wear through any material with patient, persistent friction. The craftsman had to maintain a perfect rhythm with the bow, a smooth and continuous back and forth motion, while also applying just the right amount of downward pressure. Too little and the drill would skip, too much and the shaft could snap or the delicate workpiece could crack. It was a physically demanding skill that required immense concentration, transforming raw force into controlled, precise removal of material, one microscopic grain at a time. Beyond chisels and drills, the workshop contained a host of other specialized implements that speak to a highly developed toolkit. For finishing and polishing, artisans used a range of abrasives and tools. They had polishing stones of various grits, from coarse lumps of sandstone for initial shaping to incredibly fine-grained quartzite, and even harder stones like emery for the final, glassy finish. These were often used with water or oil to create a smooth slurry. Measuring and marking tools were also essential for precision. Craftsmen used scribes made of copper or bronze to scratch layout lines onto the surface of a stone or wood block. They employed simple yet effective calipers, often made from a sprung piece of wood or reed, to transfer measurements and ensure symmetry between two sides of a container. For creating perfectly circular forms, evidence suggests the possible use of a simple lathe-like device, where the workpiece was rotated between two centers while a fixed cutting tool was held against it. The most fascinating aspect of this toolkit is its evidence of remarkable specialization. A set of tools recovered from a tomb might include dozens of differently shaped chisels, some with wide, flat edges for clearing large areas, others with fine, needle-like points for incising the tiniest hieroglyphic detail. There were gouges with curved blades for scooping out concave surfaces, and saws with teeth carved from stone or made of copper for cutting larger blocks. This wasn't a generic set of implements, it was a customized collection, honed over a lifetime of work, that allowed a master to address every challenge presented by the material. The care taken with these tools themselves is telling. Many have handles worn smooth by decades of use, and some were even buried with their owners, a sign of the deep pride and identity invested in the instruments that made such miniature masterpieces possible. Experimental archaeology has given us a profound new appreciation for the ancient artisans by putting modern tools aside and attempting to recreate their masterpieces using only the materials and methods of the time. Researchers and skilled craftspeople have set up workshops with replicas of copper chisels, stone hammers, and bow drills, embarking on journeys to hollow out a simple coal pot. The results are always the same: a renewed, staggering respect for the dexterity, patience, and embodied knowledge these ancient workers possessed. What looks simple in a museum case reveals itself to be a monumental challenge under the hammer and drill. One of the most immediate lessons is the sheer physical toll of the work. The constant, repetitive motion of working a bow drill for hours on end creates blistering friction on the hands and exhausting strain on the shoulders and back. The soundscape of the ancient workshop comes alive not with the whir of motors, but with the relentless, rhythmic scraping of stone on stone and the soft, percussive tapping of a stone hammer on a copper chisel, a sound that must have been the background music to these craftsmen's entire lives. These experimental projects consistently highlight the critical importance of the abrasive slurry. Modern attempts quickly fail when researchers try to drill into hard stone like granite or basalt using a copper drill tip alone. The soft metal simply glides over the surface, polishing it rather than cutting into it. It is only with the introduction of quartz sand and water that the process begins to work. The experimenter watches as the slurry turns into a dark, gritty paste, the sand particles embedding into the copper and truly transforming the tool into an effective grinder. This simple mixture of dirt and water becomes the most vital component, its coarse grit doing the actual work, while the metal merely provides the structure and motion. The necessity of constantly replenishing this slurry also reveals another layer of the ancient workflow, requiring either an assistant or the craftsmen themselves to pause rhythmically to add more sand and water, a dance of production and maintenance that had to be perfectly choreographed. Perhaps the most humbling revelation from these experiments is the immense, almost inconceivable amount of time required. A modern artisan using power tools can hollow out a small stone container in under an hour. Experimental archaeologists working with replicated ancient tools report spending upwards of 30 or 40 hours of active labor on a single, small vessel, and that's after already mastering the unusual techniques. This time frame doesn't account for the mistakes, the broken drill shafts, or the heart-sinking moment when a hairline crack appears in an almost finished piece, dooming weeks of work. This experimental evidence forces us to completely reevaluate the economics of ancient production. A single finely made coal pot represented not a few days of work, but potentially a month or more of a highly skilled individual's dedicated labor. This wasn't disposable mass production. Each object was a significant investment of time and expertise, which explains why they were cherished personal items, repaired when damaged, and buried with their owners for use in the afterlife. The experiments also provide fascinating insights into the social organization of this craft. The process is not well suited to solitary work. Having a second person to hold the workpiece steady, to feed abrasive into the drill hole, or to simply take over when the primary craftsman's hands became too fatigued would have drastically increased efficiency and reduced the risk of catastrophic error. This reinforces the image of the workshop as a collaborative, communal space, with masters guiding apprentices who began by performing these very support tasks. Through this hands-on replication, experimental archaeology does more than just confirm how something was made. It bridges a 3,000-year gap, allowing us to feel the ache in the shoulders of the craftsman, to share the frustration of a broken drill tip, and to experience the unparalleled satisfaction of finally holding a completed, smooth, polished container that you created from a raw stone block using nothing but patience, skill, and the ingenious tools of the ancients. While they mastered the physics of carving and drilling, the ancient artisans' true genius extended into a sophisticated, if intuitive, understanding of chemistry. They operated as material scientists, transforming raw, often unstable substances from the earth into stable, durable, and beautiful media through a series of remarkable chemical processes, all without the periodic table or modern laboratory equipment. Their workshop was a laboratory, and their knowledge was passed down through generations of trial, observation, and perfected tradition. the transformation began with the raw minerals themselves. To create the dazzling blue glaze for faience, they couldn't just use raw lapis lazuli stone, they had to liberate its color. This involved a physically demanding process of crushing the prized imported stone with heavy stone pestles in granite mortars, grinding it down repeatedly into an impossibly fine, ultramarine powder. Each grinding session would be followed by washing the powder to separate the lighter, unwanted matrix rock from the heavier, intensely blue particles of the mineral lazurite. This was a form of early gravity separation, a physical-chemical process to achieve a pure, concentrated pigment. Similarly, the malachite used for green paints and the red and yellow ochres gathered from desert cliffs had to be meticulously ground and levigated, mixed with water and left to settle so that the finest, smoothest particles could be skimmed off the top. This ensured their paints would be vibrant and free of grittiness that could scratch their delicate masterpieces or feel unpleasant on the skin. The creation of faience itself was arguably their most brilliant chemical achievement, a true synthesis of a new material. The process began with that ubiquitous substance, quartz sand, but to transform sand into a glazed ceramic, they needed a flux, a material that would lower the melting point of the quartz. Their source for this was natron, the same salt harvested from the Wadi Natron and used in mummification. When mixed with the crushed quartz and a little water, the natron began to work its magic. During the firing process, the natron would migrate to the surface of the object, carrying with it a copper colorant, often malachite or copper filings. At the high temperatures within the kiln, the natron and quartz on the surface would vitrify, melting into a thin, glassy layer. This wasn't a glaze applied on top, it was a self-creating glaze emerging from the internal chemistry of the material itself, a process we call efflorescence. The craftsman had to carefully control the kiln's atmosphere, often reducing the oxygen at key moments to ensure the copper colorant produced a brilliant blue instead of a dull red. This manipulation of fire and atmosphere to achieve a specific chemical outcome demonstrates a profound, hands-on understanding of reactive environments. The preparation of metals also required sophisticated chemical knowledge, particularly in the form of alloying. While they used pure gold for the most extravagant items, Egyptian metallurgists understood that pure, soft gold was impractical for many objects. To create a stronger, more durable material, they would create electrum, a naturally occurring or artificially crafted alloy of gold and silver. The ratio of gold to silver would alter the color, ranging from a pale, silvery gold to a rich, greenish hue, allowing for artistic expression. Working with these metals also required an understanding of their behavior under stress. They knew that repeatedly hammering copper or bronze would make it harder and stronger through a process we call work hardening, but they also knew that overworking would make it brittle and prone to cracking. Their solution was annealing, heating the metal in a charcoal furnace until it glowed a dull red, and then quenching it in water, which realigned the internal crystalline structure and restored its malleability. This cycle of hardening and annealing was a delicate dance of manipulating the metal's internal chemistry through heat and mechanical force, a practice essential for creating the fine, delicate sheets of gold leaf used in gilding. Perhaps some of their most practical chemistry was applied to organic materials, especially wood. Egypt's native acacia and sycamore fig trees provided usable timber, but the most prized woods, ebony, cedar, and pine, were expensive imports from Nubia and the Levant. Protecting these valuable resources from the relentless threat of termites and other wood-boring insects was paramount. Artisans developed effective natural pesticides and preservatives, likely using a combination of materials they knew to be toxic or repellent. They might soak or paint the wood with resins from terebinth trees, which have insecticidal properties, or with castor oil, which is known to repel beetles. For a more comprehensive treatment, they could warm a mixture of bitumen or beeswax with resin and brush it into the wood, creating a protective barrier that both deterred pests and sealed the wood against the humidity that could lead to rot. This preventative treatment ensured that a meticulously carved ebony coal pot would survive for generations, not be reduced to dust by unseen invaders. Finally, none of their intricate inlay work or multi-part constructions would have been possible without the development of powerful, durable adhesives. The Egyptian workshop was stocked with a range of natural glues, each formulated for a specific purpose. For general woodworking, they used animal glue, made by boiling animal hides, bones, and connective tissues for hours until the collagen within broke down into a thick, sticky gelatin. This glue formed a strong bond but was vulnerable to moisture. For a more waterproof seal, especially for securing inlays in stone or metal vessels, they turned to plant resins. The sap from acacia trees, gum arabic, or pistacia trees was collected and could be used as a clear, hard-drying adhesive. For the strongest, most permanent bonds, particularly in ritual objects destined for eternity, they used a mixture of resin and beeswax. By gently heating this combination, they created a thick, sticky paste that would set into a hard, insoluble cement, capable of holding a turquoise inlay in place on a stone vessel for millennia. The creation of each of these adhesives was a chemical process using heat, fermentation, or dissolution to break down complex natural substances and recombine them into a new material with entirely different and incredibly useful properties. Understanding how these containers were actually produced forces us to look beyond the solitary genius artisan and into the complex, organized world of the ancient Egyptian workshop. The scale of production and the division of labor were not one size fits all. They varied dramatically depending on who the customer was and what materials were being used. For the most extravagant royal commissions, we see the pinnacle of specialized, collaborative production, a single electrum container inlaid with lapis lazuli for a pharaoh's wife was never the product of one pair of hands. It was a symphony of coordinated expertise, likely orchestrated within a royal workshop attached to a major temple or the palace itself. Here, the division of labor was precise. One master craftsman might have been responsible for initially shaping and hammering the precious metal. Another specialist, an expert in stone, would have carefully cut and polished the lapis lazuli inlays to the exact dimensions provided. A third artisan, perhaps the most senior, would have overseen the intricate soldering process to join the components, while yet another might have been tasked with engraving the final hieroglyphic inscriptions. This wasn't a factory line in the modern sense, but a collaborative atelier where each master brought a lifetime of specialized knowledge to a single, magnificent object, ensuring every aspect met the exacting standards of the royal court. In stark contrast, the production of everyday containers for the local market operated on a completely different model. A skilled woodworker or stone carver in a smaller town or village likely worked in a much more self-sufficient manner, perhaps with the help of an apprentice or family members. He would source his own materials, a block of local limestone, a piece of sycamore fig wood, or a hippopotamus canine tooth acquired through local trade. In his smaller workshop, he would handle most stages of the process himself, from the initial rough carving to the final polishing. His output would be determined by local demand and the time-consuming nature of handcraft. He might produce a small batch of simple tubular pots or a few duck-shaped containers over several weeks, selling them directly to patrons in the community or to a merchant at the local market. This was a craft of individual entrepreneurship where the artisan's reputation for quality and his ability to network within his community were just as important as his technical skill. The objects he produced, while often beautiful, lacked the extravagant materials and extreme specialization of the royal workshops, reflecting the practical needs and more modest means of his clientele. The physical evidence from archaeological sites provides fascinating clues to these different production scales. In the royal workmen's village of Deir el-Medina, home to the artisans who built and decorated the royal tombs, we find a mix of both models. These were state-employed workers of the highest caliber, and their village workshops have yielded evidence of incredible specialization. However, we also find that in their spare time, they produced private goods, including what appear to be coal pots, for their own families or for trade with their neighbors. A single craftsman might have the skill to complete an entire container himself, but the discovery of unfinished pieces and standardized forms suggests they also understood the efficiency of batch production. An artisan might rough out the exterior shapes of 5 or 6 steatite pots at once, then spend a day hollowing them all out with the bow drill, and finally polish them as a group. This balanced approach allowed for a higher output without sacrificing the individual attention to detail that each piece required, demonstrating a flexible and pragmatic approach to meeting demand. The distribution of certain highly specific styles offers another window into production organization. The widespread find of very similar monkey-shaped containers, for example, across different regions of Egypt and spanning several decades, strongly suggests a form of pattern sharing or even a centralized production model. It's possible that a particularly popular design, perhaps originating in a major royal workshop in Thebes, was so admired that the basic form was copied by independent artisans elsewhere. They would have seen these objects in the possession of traveling officials or wealthy merchants and replicated the appealing design for their own local clients. Alternatively, it could indicate that certain workshops developed a specialty in a particular form and their products were traded over a wider area. This doesn't imply mass production, but rather a shared artistic vocabulary and the mobility of both objects and ideas, connecting craftsmen and consumers across the Nile Valley through these small, personal, and powerfully symbolic objects. The fascinating evidence from archaeological finds provides a direct window into these ancient workshops, transforming our theoretical understanding into tangible reality. Sites like Deir el-Medina, the village of the royal tomb builders, and the city of Amarna, built by the pharaoh Akhenaten, have offered unparalleled insights because they were abandoned relatively quickly, preserving a snapshot of daily life almost frozen in time. At Deir el-Medina, excavations uncovered not just the comfortable homes of these skilled workers, but also their backyard workshops. Here, archaeologists found small stone cells or makeshift structures that served as their ateliers, littered with the very debris of their craft. We find unfinished coal pots, a tubular piece of alabaster with the exterior beautifully polished, but the drilling for the interior cavity only half finished, abandoned perhaps because of an unseen crack. Nearby, a delicate monkey figurine carved from ivory lies next to it, its back not yet hollowed out, forever caught in the moment between raw material and finished masterpiece. These unfinished objects are perhaps the most valuable finds of all, as they reveal the exact sequence of operations, showing us that the exterior was almost always shaped and polished before the incredibly risky process of hollowing began. The tools themselves tell a story of a sophisticated toolkit. In these workshops, we don't find grand, complex machinery, we find the intimate, worn-down implements held in the hands of masters. There are weathered stone hammers, their surfaces smoothed and rounded from years of impact. There are sets of copper chisels and drills, their tips often work-hardened and resharpened numerous times, a testament to their constant use. Bow drill shafts made of wood have been discovered, sometimes with the stone drill bits still nestled in their ends, or with the weighted flywheel stones found nearby, ready to be reassembled. Polishing stones of various grits are found scattered about, from coarse lumps of sandstone to incredibly fine, smooth pebbles of quartzite that would have delivered that final, glassy finish. Finding these tools in situ, right where they were last set down by their owner, creates a powerful connection across millennia, allowing us to almost hear the tap 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 of the hammer and the rhythmic grinding of the bow drill. Perhaps the most vivid evidence comes from the residues left behind. Using modern scientific techniques like scanning electron microscopy and X-ray fluorescence, archaeologists have been able to analyze the microscopic traces clinging to these ancient tools and work surfaces. On a granite grinding slab, they have identified microscopic particles of malachite and galena, the very minerals used to make green eye paint and the black coal itself. This tells us that the craftsmen were not just shaping containers, they were also involved in the initial preparation of the pigments that would fill them, creating a full-spectrum production line. Inside the broken remains of a faience crucible, researchers found traces of the quartz and natron mixture, complete with copper particles that would have created the blue glaze. On the floor of a workshop at Amarna, a dark stain was analyzed and found to be the remains of spilled animal glue, likely made from boiling hides and bones, used for inlay work or securing lids. These microscopic clues are like forensic evidence, allowing us to reconstruct recipes and processes that were never written down. The workshop remains also reveal a great deal about the social and economic lives of these artisans. At Deir el-Medina, we have a wealth of written evidence in the form of Ostraka limestone flakes or potsherds used as notepads. These brief notes include records of tools being issued from central stores, requests for more raw materials like a new block of alabaster, and even notes between craftsmen complaining about the quality of copper delivered for making chisels. This shows a highly organized system where the state supplied the materials and tools, and the artisans produced goods to order. We also find evidence of a thriving private economy. In their spare time, using scrap materials or leftovers, these same royal craftsmen would produce items for their own families or to trade with their neighbors. A beautifully made coal pot found in a non-royal tomb in the village was likely made by the man who lived there as a side project, demonstrating that the drive for beauty and personal expression extended far beyond their official duties for the pharaoh. While the overarching principles of crafting these containers were shared across the Nile Valley, a keen eye can detect fascinating regional variations that reveal Egypt not as a monolithic culture, but as a tapestry of local traditions and external influences. The most fundamental division was between Upper Egypt, the long, narrow river valley stretching south to Aswan, and Lower Egypt, the broad, marshy delta region that fanned out into the Mediterranean. These two lands had been united since the dawn of the Pharaonic era, but they retained distinct identities that were subtly expressed in their material culture, including something as personal as a coal pot. In the south, in Upper Egyptian centers like Thebes and Hierakonpolis, artisans often worked with the hard, colorful stones sourced from the eastern deserts. Containers from this region frequently exhibit a preference for deep red carnelian, dark speckled granite, and the beautiful banded stone known as breccia. The forms from Upper Egypt often feel more robust and perhaps more conservative, with a strong emphasis on traditional religious symbols like the Wedjat eye and the god Horus, the patron deity of the ruling pharaohs who originally hailed from the south. The craftsmanship is no less exquisite, but it carries a certain gravity and permanence, reflecting the region's role as the spiritual heartland and the location of the royal necropolis in the Valley of the Kings. It was a style that looked inward, upholding established conventions of power and divinity. Conversely, the workshops of Lower Egypt, in cities like Memphis and later Alexandria, operated at the bustling crossroads of international trade. Situated in the delta, They had far greater access to imported materials like cedar wood from the Levant and ivory from Nubia, which arrived via Mediterranean trade routes. This constant influx of foreign goods and merchants fostered a slightly different aesthetic one that was often more experimental and receptive to outside ideas. Kohl containers from the north might incorporate lighter colored stones like off-white limestone or use imported turquoise in more abundant, flashy inlays. The forms could be a touch more fluid and decorative, sometimes favoring floral motifs like papyrus clusters, the heraldic plant of Lower Egypt, over the more rigid divine figures popular in the south. This was a style shaped by commerce and exchange, always with one eye looking outward to the sea. These regional preferences were not rigid borders but rather gentle currents, and they were profoundly influenced by the most powerful force of all, royal patronage. When a new pharaoh from a southern dynasty established his capital in the north, or vice versa, his royal workshops would set the stylistic tone for the entire region, often blending elements from both traditions. The most fascinating variations, however, came from the edges of the empire where Egyptian culture met and mingled with its neighbors. In the borderlands of Nubia, to the south, we find a unique hybrid style. A kohl pot might be carved from typical Egyptian alabaster and take the form of a classic monkey, but the animal's features could be rendered with a slightly different sensibility, perhaps more abstract or emphasizing different anatomical details, reflecting the local Nubian artisans' own artistic heritage that they brought to an Egyptian workshop. From the Levant in modern-day Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, a different kind of influence arrived, not through conquest but through trade. Levantine merchants and craftsmen living in Egypt occasionally introduced technical innovations. There is evidence that the use of the vertical, foot-powered lathe for creating perfectly symmetrical wooden vessels may have been a technology that filtered into the delta from the Levant, allowing northern Egyptian workshops to produce certain container forms with newfound speed and precision. In terms of design, the occasional appearance of purely decorative spirals or guilloche patterns on otherwise Egyptian containers hints at a subtle absorption of Canaanite or Phoenician artistic tastes, likely to cater to the preferences of an international clientele living in the cosmopolitan delta ports. Even the powerful empires of Mesopotamia, though far away, left a faint but discernible mark during periods of intense diplomatic exchange, such as the Amarna period. In the art of this time, we see a slight relaxation of formal Egyptian proportions and a fleeting interest in more naturalistic depictions. A kohl container from this era might feature a monkey whose pose is a little more dynamic or a flower whose petals are more fluidly rendered, showing the subtle influence of the art that arrived on clay tablets and traded goods from the courts of Mitanni or Babylon. These foreign elements were never copied outright. They were always filtered through an Egyptian lens, adapted and integrated until they felt like a natural, if exotic, flourish on a fundamentally Egyptian object. This ability to absorb without being overwhelmed was a testament to the incredible strength and confidence of ancient Egyptian culture, a confidence that allowed a craftsman in a delta workshop to add a foreign-inspired pattern to a kohl pot, secure in the knowledge that it would still, unquestionably, be an Egyptian masterpiece. This transformation from a simple object into a sacred vessel likely began at the very start of the process with the selection of the raw materials itself. For a container destined for a temple or a tomb, the block of stone or the piece of ivory wasn't just chosen for its beauty or workability, it was ceremonially selected. A priest or a high-ranking official might have been present to perform a short rite, perhaps an offering to the patron deity of craftsmen, Ptah, or to the specific god for whom the object was ultimately intended. The material was not seen as inert, it was believed to possess its own spirit, a life force that needed to be honored and properly directed. By consecrating the stone or wood at the outset, the craftsmen were acknowledging that they were not simply carving an object, but collaborating with the material's inherent spirit to create something far greater than the sum of its parts. This sacred partnership set the tone for the entire creation process, infusing every subsequent strike of the hammer and turn of the drill with a higher purpose. The very space in which these special containers were made might have been considered ritually significant. While we often imagine workshops as dusty, practical places, evidence suggests that areas designated for creating funerary or divine objects could be purified spaces. Archaeologists have found remains of what appear to be small shrines or altars within workshop areas at sites like Deir el-Medina. These spaces might have been purified with water from the Nile, which was itself considered sacred, or with the smoke of burning incense like frankincense or myrrh. Incense was believed to cleanse a space of malevolent forces and please the gods, creating a suitable environment for crafting objects of eternal significance. The artisans themselves may have undergone rituals of purification before beginning their work on such a project, perhaps involving fasting, washing, or reciting specific prayers to ensure they were in a state of ritual cleanliness. This physical and spiritual preparation created a clear boundary between the mundane act of carving and the sacred act of creation, reminding everyone involved that they were participating in a process that bridged the world of the living and the divine. The most compelling evidence for these rituals comes from the objects themselves, particularly from the practice of inscribing them with words of power. On many high-status containers, we find short hieroglyphic inscriptions that are far more than just ownership tags. These are active spells designed to function for eternity. A common inscription is the simple phrase Ankh Wedja Seneb, which translates to life, prosperity, health. This was not a hopeful wish. In the context of a sacred object, it was a powerful invocation, a permanent command for these blessings to be upon the owner. For a container holding coal, an inscription might directly address its function, such as, "For the protection of the eyes of Name," or "Horus gives his protection." The ancient Egyptians held a profound belief in the power of the spoken and written word, the concept of Heka. By carving these words onto the container, the artisan was activating a permanent magical formula. The very act of inscribing became a ritual in itself, with each carved glyph charging the object with protective energy, turning the physical vessel into a functional amulet that would actively defend its owner. Perhaps the most definitive ritual moment was the opening of the mouth ceremony. We know this complex rite was performed on statues of gods and on mummies to restore their senses and allow them to receive offerings in the afterlife. There is strong circumstantial evidence to suggest a simplified, analogous version of this ceremony was performed on certain grave goods, including these intricately made coal pots. The logic is beautifully consistent. If a statue needed its mouth open to breathe, eat, and speak, then a container might need its own symbolic senses activated to perform its sacred duty. A priest might have touched the container's opening with a special adze-shaped instrument, the same tool used on mummies, while reciting spells that allowed it to see the coal within and protect the eyes of the deceased. This ritual would have transformed the object from a beautifully made box into a fully functional spiritual tool, its purpose sanctified and its power unleashed for the journey into the afterlife. The container was no longer just a possession, it was a sentient guardian, ritually awakened to serve its owner for all eternity. The influence of Egyptian container craftsmanship rippled out across the ancient world, carried by trade routes, conquest, and the simple, undeniable appeal of their technical and artistic mastery. When the Greeks began to interact more intensely with Egypt during the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, They were profoundly impressed by the sophistication of Egyptian art and technology. Greek artisans, particularly those working in the new, vibrant medium of pottery, eagerly adopted and adapted the Egyptian forms they encountered. The iconic arabellos, a small, spherical or globular oil flask used by Greek athletes, bears a striking resemblance in both its size and purpose to the Egyptian coal pot. While the Greeks perfected their own black figure and red figure painting techniques to decorate these vessels, the underlying concept of a small, personal, beautifully crafted container for precious substances was a direct inheritance from the Nile Valley. This wasn't mere copying, it was a creative assimilation where Greek painters replaced images of Bes and Tauret with scenes of their own heroes and gods, yet the object's fundamental role as a cherished personal item remained unchanged. The torch of this artistic legacy was then passed directly to the Romans, who absorbed Egyptian culture wholesale following the conquest by Augustus. Roman fascination with Egypt, known as Egyptomania, saw a massive demand for genuine Egyptian artifacts and skilled reproductions. Roman artisans, masters of mass production themselves, set up workshops that expertly copied Egyptian styles, creating coal pots and other cosmetic vessels from blown glass, bronze, and carved stone that mimic the classic forms of the New Kingdom. They particularly favored the god Bes, whose protective image appears on countless Roman-era amulets and containers found across the empire, from the streets of London to the villas of Pompeii. The Romans also took the Egyptian concept of the cosmetic container and industrialized it, producing small, cylindrical glass coal tubes on a scale the Egyptians never attempted. While these lack the hand-carved individuality of their pharaonic predecessors, they democratized the object, making a version of this ancient luxury accessible to citizens across the vast Roman world, ensuring the daily ritual of eye protection and adornment continued for centuries. Perhaps the most significant legacy, however, is not in the objects themselves but in the persistence of the techniques, the fundamental tools and methods developed by Egyptian artisans, the bow drill, the use of abrasive slurries for cutting and polishing, the principles of stoneworking and fine joinery became the bedrock of the Mediterranean craft tradition. These skills were passed down through generations of Greek, Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic craftsmen, evolving but never truly disappearing. The intricate stone and wood inlay work that defines later Islamic art, for example, from the stunning mosaics of the Alhambra to the delicate marquetry of Ottoman boxes, operates on principles that would have been perfectly familiar to an Egyptian master working on an ebony coal pot inlaid with turquoise 3,000 years earlier. The unbroken chain of craftsmanship, though often overlooked, connects the ancient world to the medieval and right into the modern era. Today, this legacy is experiencing a powerful revival in the hands of experimental archaeologists and a new generation of artisans dedicated to historical reproduction. These modern craftspeople are not simply imitating ancient art, they are engaging in a deep, practical dialogue with the past, using meticulously reconstructed tools, copper chisels, stone hammers, and bow drills. They attempt to recreate these containers using only the materials and methods available to the ancients. The process is incredibly humbling. It quickly dispels any notion of primitive technology and replaces it with a staggering respect for the skill, patience, and profound material intelligence these ancient workers possessed. A modern jeweler might spend over 40 hours using a replicated bow drill and quartz sand just to hollow out a small alabaster pot, a testament to the immense value and meaning imbued in every single ancient artifact we now find in museum cases. These reproduction pieces, commissioned by museums and private collectors, serve a vital purpose. They allow us to handle and study perfect facsimiles of objects too fragile to be touched, bringing the past to life in a way photographs never can. The weight of the stone, the cool smoothness of the polish, the satisfying click of a well-fitted lid, these tactile experiences forge a direct, emotional connection to the ancient craftsmen. Furthermore, the work of these modern artisans is answering long-standing archaeological questions. By recording their failures and successes, they provide crucial data on how long certain processes took, what sequences of operation were most efficient, and what the telltale marks of specific ancient tools actually look like under a microscope. They are in effect completing the archaeological record, adding the missing manual of techniques that was never written down. In their workshops, the rhythmic sound of the bow drill has returned, not as a relic, but as a living testament to one of humanity's most enduring and beautiful traditions of making. And this incredible legacy of craftsmanship extends far beyond the borders of Egypt itself, carried along bustling trade networks that connected the Nile Valley to the entire ancient world. The very materials they coveted tell a story of global exchange. The deep blue lapis lazuli journeyed from distant mines in modern-day Afghanistan, traveling overland through Mesopotamia and across the Sinai Peninsula on the backs of donkeys and camels. The gleaming turquoise was painstakingly quarried from the harsh deserts of the Sinai, a region the Egyptians controlled for centuries specifically to secure this precious resource. Even the dense, black ebony wood was imported from the lands of Nubia to the south and from the mysterious realm of Punt, likely located in the Horn of Africa. These were not casual acquisitions, they were the result of state-sponsored expeditions, diplomatic gifts between kings, and the tireless work of merchants who understood the immense value of these exotic raw materials. A single coal pot crafted from imported ivory and inlaid with Afghan lapis was more than just a makeup container. It was a symbolic map of the Egyptian empire, a physical representation of the pharaoh's power to command the riches of the known world. Owning such an object meant possessing a piece of that vast, interconnected world, a tiny monument to human ingenuity and the enduring desire to seek out beauty from the farthest corners of the earth. The sophistication of these objects also forces us to completely rethink our perception of ancient technology, moving beyond the simple image of stone pyramids to appreciate the microengineering required for these miniature marvels. Consider the precision of the bow drill, a tool that allowed them to bore deep, narrow holes into the hardest stones with astonishing accuracy. This was not a crude instrument, it was a masterpiece of applied physics, utilizing a weighted flywheel to maintain momentum and a simple abrasive slurry of quartz sand to do the actual cutting, a process that essentially created a self-renewing diamond-tipped drill bit thousands of years before modern industry. The creation of faience was another stroke of chemical genius, a complex process of combining crushed quartz, natron, and copper minerals to create a self-glazing ceramic that emerged from the kiln with a brilliant, glass-like surface. This was not pottery, it was high-temperature chemistry, requiring an intimate understanding of how materials react under intense heat and controlled atmospheres. These artisans were, in every sense, material scientists. They knew that repeatedly hammering copper would make it harder through work hardening, and they knew that heating it would restore its malleability through annealing. They developed plant-based resins and animal glues powerful enough to hold stone inlays in place for millennia. This deep, practical knowledge, passed down through generations without a single written manual, represents a vast encyclopedia of technological understanding that was just as advanced in its own way as any modern laboratory. Ultimately, the most profound story these containers tell is not one of technology or trade, but of universal human values that transcend time and culture. The drive to create beauty, to transform a simple functional object into something that delights the eye and pleases the hand, is an impulse we share with those ancient craftspeople. The desire for personal protection and well-being, whether from the harsh sun or from unseen malevolent forces, connects our modern concerns with theirs. The deep-seated need for personal expression and identity, communicated through the objects we choose to own and use, is as relevant today as it was in the time of the pharaohs. We see our own lives reflected in these intimate artifacts, the care a parent took in applying protective kohl to their child's eyes, the pride a person felt in owning a beautifully made object, the hope they carried for health and good fortune. These were not distant, mystical figures. They were people who laughed, loved, and worried about their families, who took pride in their work and sought to create a better life. The kohl container, held in the palm of your hand, becomes a powerful bridge across 3,000 years, a silent yet eloquent reminder that the hopes, fears, and artistic spirit of humanity remain beautifully, comfortingly constant.